The slice approach is also an important type of approach shot to master because sometimes your opponent's going to hit the ball short, but it'll still stay low, and it'll be difficult to hit up on with a lot of topspin and be aggressive. So that slice allows you to hit an aggressive ball and follow it into the net. And also the slice will stay low when it bounces, and that forces your opponent to hit up on the tennis ball, which could give you an easy volley, a volley that's a little bit higher over the net that you can hit down on. Now the most typical type of a slice approach shot is the backhand slice approach. So we'll start with that. And the mechanics of the slice approach shot are pretty much the same as just a normal slice backhand. And that's what I'm shadowing here to start. I'm not moving. The main difference, just like the topspin backhand approach, is the footwork. You're going to take a karaoke step where your back foot, which is my right foot in this case since I'm a lefty, will step behind my front left foot as I hit. So if we watch that, as I hit that shot, as I slice the ball, my right foot comes behind my left foot, and that allows me to stay sideways and still close in on the net. So if we watch the full sequence now, I'm going to start at the baseline, close on my approach shot like I'm doing here, and then I slice the ball and stay sideways with that drop step, and then from here, again, I continue to close the net. And if we clip to this view here, looking over the net, you'll see that my placement is again the same. I go down the line with some margin for error with the sideline and the baseline, and this ball is going to stay a little bit lower and hopefully force my opponent to hit up on the ball so I can put the next volley away. The forehand slice approach is not a shot you'll typically use. If you get a short ball, most of the time you want to roll over it, but sometimes you'll have to either slice it, or if your opponent's playing really far back, it can be a good change-up. It'll force him to hit up on the ball, and again, that can give you an easier volley. And the technique for the forehand slice approach is pretty similar to a forehand volley. Behind me here, I'm hitting a slice approach, and when I pivot out with my outside foot and get my racket into position, this looks pretty similar to how I prepare to hit a forehand volley. And the main difference really is the length of my swing. I'm going to swing a little bit more because I have to put a little bit more juice on the tennis ball. But the mechanics again are the same. I step in with my inside foot and then I hit pretty much through the ball. I'm not really slicing down too much. And if we clip to the view from over the net, you'll see that I hit this ball down the line, and then hopefully it's going to hit and not bounce too high and set me up for an easy volley on the next shot. If we go back to the side view, I'm going to start at the baseline now. And the one thing that I want to point out, when I close, I'm not going to get my body sideways when I move through and hit the tennis ball. And that's the same thing that happens on the volley. You don't get as sideways on a volley as you do for your typical forehand or backhand ground stroke. So as I close on the tennis ball, again, when I get near the ball, I kind of pivot out and get my racket into position, and then I'm going to step forward with my inside foot, swing through the tennis ball, kind of like a volley, longer swing, and then I'm going to continue to close the net, hit my split step, and be ready for the volley. Oh. A typical question every player has to ask himself is, when they're hitting a first serve, how hard do they want to hit it, and how often do they want to get their serve in? What do they want their first service percentage to be? Howard Brody, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, did a study that showed, let's say your maximum serve speed was 100 miles an hour. That's as hard as you could hit it, and you got it in 50% of the time. If you dropped your serve speed to 90 miles an hour, so in other words, you hit 90% as hard as you could, your serve was now 30% more likely to go in. So in other words, at 90 miles an hour, your serve would go in 65% of the time, again, as opposed to 100 miles an hour, where your serve would only go in half the time, 50% of the time. A lot of players like to step up to the baseline, toss the ball, and just hit as hard as they can. It's fun to go for the ace. But there are a number of advantages for dropping your first service speed down a little bit. Consistency is one of those. Like Dr. Brody proved in his study, if you drop your speed a little bit, you'll get much more consistent. That's huge. But there's also some other advantages I want to talk about. The first is variety. Keeping your opponent guessing every single time you step up to the baseline for a first serve is an enormous advantage. You want your opponent to have to worry about where you're going to put the serve, how hard you're going to hit it, and what kind of spin you're going to put on the ball. So if you hit at a base service speed, let's say 90 miles an hour, and you can go up from there as well as down, your opponent is not going to know how hard you're going to hit it. If you just rip it, let's say 100 miles an hour every single time, that's one less thing your opponent has to worry about. Now he only has to worry about the placement and the spin, and maybe even fewer than that, because if you're hitting as hard as you can, you might sacrifice, you might lose some of that other variety. You won't have as much spin, and you might not be able to control the placement as well. Let me talk about Pete Sampras for a minute to emphasize how important variety is and how much more important variety is than power. Pete Sampras' average first serve speed was about 120 miles an hour, which is certainly fast, but it wasn't nearly as fast as some of the other guys he played against. Now that said, Pete had arguably, and in my opinion, the best serve ever, because he combined, he had some pace, but he also had spin and placement, and those three things made his serve devastating. His opponents never knew what was coming. They didn't know how hard he was going to hit it. They didn't know where it was going, and he could put that serve on a dime, and they didn't know what kind of spin he was going to put on the ball. So Pete's example is instructive for everybody else. He achieved the greatest serve of all time through variety and not power, and chances are you can attain your best possible serve through variety as opposed to power as well. The second point I want to make, and this sort of goes back to Dr. Brody's findings, is that up until about the top 500 players in the world, tennis is entirely a game of errors. It's about winning the battle of errors. If you make more errors than your opponent, you're probably going to lose, and if your opponent makes more errors than you, you are most likely going to win. In my opinion, missing a high number of first serves is a huge error. For most players, their second serve is a defensive shot, and if you take a little bit off your first serve, it's still going to be a weapon, and if you can get it in 30% more often, that means you're on offense 30% more of the time. And let's face it, you're probably not facing Agassi, so you don't have to worry about taking that little bit extra off your first serve. The other thing this does is it gives you a psychological advantage. If you have a very high first serve percentage, your opponent's going to notice that. That's going to put a lot of pressure on him to serve well and hold serve because he figures he's going to have a tough time breaking you. So the next time you go out to serve, think about taking a little bit off your first serve, maybe put a little bit more spin on the ball so it gets pulled into the court. That might allow you to place it a little bit better, and that should help you serve more effectively on your first serve.